Hello and welcome back to the virtual classroom. I'm your host, Dr. Olmsted, and welcome back to part 2 of our lecture regarding 1920s eugenics and Mexicano resistance. Now, we left off with absolute tragedy, talking about the forced sterilizations of groups that were deemed non-white or deemed that they could be hurting the white supremacy worldview or the white supremacy control of the United States. Of course, this is a long enduring legacy of enslavement of African Americans and that black white binary. And what we see how it plays out is using these so called pseudoscientific ideas like eugenics, like race breeding, like disease ridden nature of people under the auspices of public health to control, to demonize, and to ostracize groups of people based on essentially phenotype, the color of someone's skin, or their culture, or their heritage, or their national origin. But what historians argue was a new generation of Mexicanos. As we would call it, the Mexican American generation. You see, this generation that came of age in the 1920s and 30s, extending through World War II, this is known as the Mexican American generation that you can see on the screen. And so the difference is that this was a new, larger generation that had citizenship by birth. And as such, they were determined to stand up for their civil rights. Now, their parents were activists, and they were inspired by the rhetoric of the Mexican Revolution. But the so-called Mexican generation that had existed prior to the 1920s, again, look at my screen, it's that from the Mexican-American War through about the 1920s, you have the Mexican generation. What really defined them wasn't that they weren't active, wasn't they didn't fight back, wasn't they weren't even proud Americans, but they still largely seemed to look back to Mexico, longing for the cultural traditions of Mexico, like the Fiestas Patrias we talked about before. In contrast, their children, this Mexican American generation, they often had their U.S. citizenship not by naturalization, not by giving it to the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, but they had it by birthright. They were born here, they were raised here, they came of age here, and they never knew anything different. And they may have been very young, maybe when their parents fled Mexico for the Mexican Revolution. But as US citizens, this new generation was much more adamant to fight for rights as citizens. They most often spoke much better English than their parents. They could navigate both worlds much better. And they would start a number of organizations to help this process during the 1920s. Starting with the Orden de Hijos de America, the Order of the Sons of America, 1921. The Order of the Sons of America was one of the first statewide Mexican-American civil rights organizations in Texas. Founded by 37 men on October 13, 1921, at a barbershop of Ramon Carvajal in San Antonio. It was originally conceived as an anti-lynching organization, but quickly expanded to a broader mission. The purpose, as it was said, was to, quote, influence in all fields of social, economic, and political action in order to realize the greatest enjoyment possible of all the rights and privileges and prerogatives extended by the American Constitution, unquote. This is a very different, it wasn't just anti-lynching. This wasn't just about workers' rights. This was about civil rights. This was about taking and laying claim to their rights as US citizens, fighting for those rights for equality. Again, this is a change within the Mexican American generation. Now, they also helped to organize Latino workers to raise awareness of civil rights issues and fight for fair wages, fair housing, and fair education. Likewise, the most famous group founded was the League of United Latin American Citizens, aka Lulac. And again, this signifies how this Mexican American generation sought to advance from their past and see themselves as permanent citizens of the United States with all the rights and privileges of American citizenship. They sought to synthesize their experience based on their relationship to their Mexican roots, their Mexican American reality, and the search for a U.S. future. No Mexican American organization better exemplified this search than LULAC. Founded in 1929, it is known as the oldest American civil rights association. So it's established in Corpus Christi, Texas on May 18th and 19th, 1929, as various delegates called for an assemblage and a creation of a new civil rights organization. They pledged their commitment to LULAC as a vehicle for the elimination of discrimination and the advancement of full citizenship rights for Mexican Americans. It is the longest continuing Latino civil rights group in the nation. Mexican Americans in LULAC desired integration and acceptance as U.S. citizens, but at the same time wanted to negotiate in maintaining at least portions of their Mexican heritage. Integral to LULAC's pursuit of cultural pluralism was Mexican cultural retention. Maintenance of the Spanish language symbolized this effort, and LULAC promoted both Spanish and bilingualism. But I want to make a couple of very important points here. Number one, the name LULAC was very specific. It accentuated the inherent Americanism of Mexican Americans, but still had to confront the ethnic labeling. This involved agreeing to the term Latin American. In fact, the LULAC News, their pamphlet put out, acknowledged that the term had been a compromise to accommodate the particular position of Mexican Americans in the Southwest. You see, LULAC needed a term that would not offend Anglos, but at the same time convince them that Mexican Americans were, in fact, American citizens, not just Mexicans. In other words, with their racial identity being questioned by Anglos, Mexican Americans formed this organization in an effort to assert their citizenship, as mentioned in their name, they are American citizens, and perhaps more importantly, to establish their whiteness. Notice the focus on Latin roots. This is far more conservative than promoting we are brown and we are proud. It's very similar to how the NAACP for African Americans would oppose Black nationalism for the 1920s. LULAC, by choosing the name United Latin American Citizens, were harkening back to a more Europeanized idea. They thought that Mexican Americans were white by law and should not be discriminated or segregated the way African Americans were, which of course this will hurt a potential coalition that could have emerged between the two groups had they fought in solidarity. Acculturation also led LULAC to adjust to a greater degree of freedom for women, though still subordinate to men. One of the largest complaints lobbied at LULAC was it seemed to be a concession group, focused too much on the middle and upper classes. Again, take the issue of women. The group still subordinated women, but encouraged the women to be more free, to possess active social lives in charitable work outside the home, but not to pursue careers outside the home. And what this does, and you might think, well, that makes sense, right? Well, it does from a middle and upper class perspective, but it ignores the reality that working class women always had to work in order to sustain their families. This idea that women should be in the home was very much a middle and upper class ideal. And with Lulac still subordinating women, saying, hey, women, stay in the home, be mothers, get outside and do some charity work. That's a middle class virtue, a middle class ideal. And as a result of that, Lulac, with the focus on whiteness, with the focus on their Latin American cultural identity, even though they propose and promote good things, by nature they are a conservative, mild, more mainstream, more palatable to Anglo American group, which has both benefits and drawbacks. Nonetheless, LULAC will be integral in helping to fund legal challenges to defeat segregation. We'll talk more about that in coming weeks. So, despite these limitations, LULAC was vitally important. For example, in 1930, for the first time ever on the US Census, the US government included Mexican as a separate racial category. Notice on the thing on the left, it was instructions to the 1930 census takers. So regarding column 12, I circled it for you, color or race. W for white, NEG for Negro, MEX for Mexican. Also Indian, Chinese, Japanese, Filipino, Hindu, Korean. For any other person, another race, write the name race in full. For the first and only time on the US Census, under the racial category, alongside white and black, in this case Negro, and Indian, was the category Mexican, designated as a separate racial group in the United States. And LULAC was adamant in fighting against this. Because this meant, in theory, that this was overturning the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, saying that Mexicanos were denoted as a different race. This was not just saying they're off-white, this was saying they are not white, by denoting them as a separate racial category in the census. And this is a decade in the making in 1930, in large part due to the so-called health and eugenic arguments of the 1920s. It also undermined decades of work by Mexicanos to be assimilated as white for acceptance, a primary mission of LULAC. And it would take the decade of the 1930s and serious challenges by LULAC, who, in their own words, claimed to help get it removed before 1940. LULAC arguing, among other things, that Mexicans were legally white, again, based on the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Yes, we're back to that again. And for the next 30 years, LULAC will serve as the principal and most visible Mexican-American civil rights organization in the United States. Although founded in Texas and initially concentrated on Mexican-American issues in Texas, LULAC by 1960 had become a national organization with branches throughout the Southwest and Midwest, the regions that contain the vast majority of Mexican Americans. In later decades, it was spread to include other Latino peoples, including Puerto Ricans, and to a lesser extent, Cuban Americans. They would also greatly help in education. LULAC would help establish their own private educational facilities. Remember, they're facing a situation in the 1920s and 30s where we have three separate schools in the Southwest, white, black, and the Mexican school. And LULAC helped to fund these, what were known as escuelitas, these little schools. And these were these small schools that were private schools taught by part-time teachers that provided instruction in bilingualism, both English and Spanish. Parents would also send their kids to these schools funded by LULAC. They also send them to Catholic schools, as well as Protestant schools, these Christian schools. And so you not only get the 3 R's, reading, writing, and arithmetic, but also religion. And so again, both Catholic and Protestant schools. They would also, LULAC would help families establish their own independent public schools. For example, the San Felipe Independent School District, established in 1929 in Del Rio, Texas, It was the first of its kind in Texas. It was completely controlled by Mexican Americans, from superintendent to school board members to principals to teachers. Or the Trinidad High School, established within Colorado ISD, designed to help promote a better acceptance or a better experience for Mexican American students. They would also start trying to use the court system to fight against this racism and segregation, such as the case with Jesus Salvatierra versus Del Rio ISD in 1930. This becomes the first major court case tried in Texas that attempted to dismantle the segregation of Mexicano school children. The plaintiffs argued that the school district policy of segregating Mexican children based on national origins was unconstitutional. This becomes one of the first court cases to argue the unconstitutionality of racial segregation in schools. That was being argued by Lulac founder and lawyer Alfonso Perales. Now, initially, at the local level, they're victorious in this case. But on appeals, it would be overturned and would suffer in the appeal system. So after Perales wins this victory for the plaintiffs in saying that segregation is unconstitutional, it will be overturned, this victory, via appeals. But this will set a legal precedent for future school segregation cases, including the now famous Brown v. Board of Education, 1954. Or take the Lemon Grove incident in California in 1930s. So this incident occurred in Lemon Grove, California in 1930, where the local school board attempted to build a separate school for the children of Mexican origin. Turned away Mexican children, they would turn away Mexican children at the schoolhouse door, directing them to the new school, which came to be known as the stable. That's pretty much all it was a place for animals, size-wise. Parents began to refuse to send their children to the new school and launched a boycott. The plaintiff here was Robert Alvarez, one of the children denied access to the school. In the decision, the judge ruled that children of Mexican origin could not be segregated under the laws of the state of California because they were of the Caucasian race. And laws allowing segregation of so-called Oriental, Asian, or Negro, or Indian children, therefore did not apply. So the judge in California rules that because people of Mexican descent were in fact white by law, you could not segregate and separate them, unlike the way you could for Asians, or African Americans, or Native Americans. In this landmark lawsuit that resulted from this incident became the first successful desegregation court decision in the history of the United States, and once again became foundational to the famous Brown v. Board of Education. Now, I'm going to post a video on Blackboard regarding a movie that was made about this event, Alvarez versus Lemon Grove. So part of your homework is going to be to watch that as well. So as we can see, there were a lot of problems in the 1920s. The Roaring 20s were great. They were roaring. They were exciting. There were also a lot of racism and backlash and conservatism. But from that position, we also begin to see this new generation of Mexicano activists that begin to push against their prescribed boundaries, push for inclusion and civil rights as U.S. citizens. And this was going to continue throughout the decades, even though, yes, things are going to get worse before they get better. But that's a topic for next time. So until then, take care and bye-bye.